This is chapter 17, post-it notes. Chapter 17 is about human health and environmental risks. So far, we've been talking about a lot about pollution and some of the substances that can get into the environment. And this chapter is focusing mainly on how that impacts us in terms of our health and other things that affect our health. What are some of the toxins that's out there, and what are some of the factors that affect how these toxins affect our bodies. The chapter opener is talking about this woman who lived in a neighborhood in Louisiana near a oil refinery, and the people of that neighborhood were noticing that there were higher incidents of asthma and cancer and birth defects, and believed that the oil refinery that was in their neighborhood was the cause. So she and the other citizens took it upon themselves to um, be a scientist, collect samples, document what was going on, and really put a pressure on the company um, to pay for the damages, buy up the neighborhood so they can relocate and things like that. Um, so it just goes to show that sometimes people of the citizens themselves have to be educated about what's going on and try to put pressure on the industry and the government to get what they need to get done. Okay, so we are talking about human health risks, right? There are three general types of health risks. There's the physical, which is the injuries and death that can happen from things like natural disasters, but it also includes things like UV exposure. Right, so those are physical risks, and then there are biological and chemical risks that this chapter focuses mainly on. Biological risks are diseases, right? Whether it's kind of chronic diseases or infectious diseases, and then there's chemical risks as well. Those are exposure to chemicals. Okay, so of the leading causes of deaths in the world, you have this breakdown about more than 3/4 of the deaths are caused by diseases, right? So not like accidents and, you know, other physical or chemical exposures. Uh, It's mostly cardiovascular disease is the largest. You got cancers and respiratory diseases, and you got other things like that. About quarter of it is coming from infectious diseases. And infectious diseases meaning that these are caused by pathogens, right? Pathogens are viruses, bacteria, protists, and things that causes illnesses. And this is a breakdown of it. The majority of the infectious diseases are coming from these 6 types of diseases. So you got your respiratory illnesses and AIDS, and pathogenic. Pathogens from water that might cause diarrhea, diseases, tuberculosis, malaria, and childhood diseases like measles and tetanus and mumps and things like that. Okay, there are acute versus chronic types of diseases. So acute diseases are things that happened, immediately. So some of these diseases are acute, and some of these, yeah. So some of these diseases are acute, and chronic diseases are things that happen over time. So these are really like cardiovascular diseases and cancers and things. And with the chronic diseases, there are different risk factors, and it varies between low-income countries and high-income countries. In low-income countries, these leading health risks tend to be things like some that has to do with lack of nutrition, like low weight and during childhood, but also high blood pressure, unsafe sex, unsafe water, and things like that. And then when you're looking at high income countries, they tend to be more of things like tobacco use and overweight and obesity, cardiovascular disease associated with that. So the type of health risks between um, developing and developed nations tend to be a little bit different because of the lifestyle, right? Okay, so where are we here? Chronic diseases in humans. Okay, yeah. So here's a traditional risk and modern risks, varying over time. Never mind. Okay, this has to do with this one. So infectious diseases. There are different ways in which infectious diseases, so remember, these are things that are caused by viruses, bacteria, uh, protists, and other types of pathogens. How they get into the body, these are the different ways they can get into the body, right? You can get it from other animals, other humans. You can get it from the water, like little protists and bacteria and stuff that can make you sick. You can breed some of this stuff. You can get it from food, and you can get it from different animals. It's called an epidemic if you have lots of people getting sick from it at any given amount of time, and like this rapid increase in sicknesses over a certain range. It's a pandemic if it covers a wide range, wide area. So geographically, if it covers a lot of area, then it's considered a pandemic. There has been, historically, there has been few important infectious diseases that you should be familiar with. And some of these are related to unsafe drinking water, like cholera, hepatitis, and diarrheal diseases. And these have killed millions and millions of people in the course of the history. And, actually to a point where it's affected population growth in some of the areas. And in addition to that, there are 3 infectious diseases that caused by some kind of a host. So it's either passed on from people to people or passed on from animals that have had a huge impact on our population, or big enough that it is noticeable. Human population has always been growing, right? We've talked about that. Even the really big one, like the plague, put a little blip in the population growth, but the human population always rebounded. So some of these historical diseases is the Black Plague, or the Black Death, or bubonic plague. I'm sure you learned about it in history class, right? This goes here. Let me put this here. Historical diseases, right? Between the 1300s and through the 1800s, it killed millions of people, and a quarter of Europe was affected in the 1300s. It was pretty significant, right? So that was caused by bacteria. Bacteria that was carried by fleas, which was on rodents. So as the rodents are running around, they're carrying fleas, and the fleas also bite the people and then pass on the bacteria that way. Nowadays, this will be very easily treatable with antibiotics because it's bacterial, but back then there was no antibiotics, so that was a big deal. Another disease that affect millions of people and continues to. This one is probably one of the 3 that's still a major problem today, is malaria. Malaria comes from a protist that lives inside mosquitoes, and when mosquitoes bite a human, it transfers the protist to to people, and that causes sickness. Generally more common in tropical regions. It's been eliminated in the U.S. I don't think it's an issue in European nations because it might be too cold, maybe. But it's still a big health risk in Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, Central and South America, the Middle East, all still suffering from malaria. Affects 350 to 500 million people per year, which I think is really, really high. Up to 1 million people die from it each year. Okay, so that's malaria. And the other one's tuberculosis. Also generally been treated and on a decline because of antibiotics. However, there has been some concern about antibiotic resistant strains that's been popping up, and so so some of these old diseases might be making a comeback because of the overuse of antibiotics, and they're becoming resistant to them. So tuberculosis is bacterial, but this one can be passed from people to people because the bacteria can be airborne. So I guess maybe forms a cyst or something, and people cough, and then it goes into the air, and that can, you know, breathe it in, and you can catch it as well. Still millions die each year. And like I said, antibiotics is effective. However, there are resistant strains out there that's making it more difficult to treat. So those are the historical diseases. There are also emergent infectious diseases. So these are kind of new within the last 20 years or so. A lot of these have jumped from other animals. And although most of them are not as widely spread as some of these historical, it's not like you're not talking millions and millions of people being affected. Well, actually, I take that back, except for AIDS. A lot of these, especially these viral ones, are spreading very rapidly because people move around more. So back in the days, you know, people were confined to their continents and not really prevented the spread of disease, but now people are flying and things are being moved around constantly, so that also increases the likelihood of disease spreading. So of these emergent diseases, probably one of the biggest one is the HIV AIDS, right? Let's make sure I got everything right. This one probably jumped from primates. So there's some indications that it came from chimpanzees somewhere in Africa, I think back in the 60s, some, you know, hunter butchering a chimpanzee might have caught it, and then it just kind of went from there. It's a sexually transmitted disease, and also drug users sharing needles, so it has to be kind of fluid contact. 33 million people infected today. Although we have better medicines to treat them, we still don't have a cure or a vaccine or anything like that. At least nothing all that effective. And there are antiviral drugs, but it's still very expensive, and that's the issue. It tends to the biggest area that's affected is Sub-Saharan Africa, as we talked about in the population chapter, and lack of medical accessibility is one of the problems. Another emerging disease is Ebola. I'm sure you heard of it. There was several years ago, there was a little outbreak in Africa of Ebola, and people are freaking out because this is a very scary disease, because it's very lethal. More than half the people or something like that that are individuals have suffered 50 to 89% death rate. So likelihood of dying from it is really, really high. And it happens very, very quickly too. It's like within weeks, you're dead. And it's like a horrendous, you know, you're bleeding from like everywhere. And so it's just a horrible disease, but it's very confined and it's very rare. So even though it sounds really scary, and it's very lethal, it's tends to be very confined and very rare. So it's not something that we need to be immediately concerned about. At least you and I don't need to be concerned about. Let me stop here for now because I'm running out of time. Okay, I'll talk about mad cow.